Okay. So related to pointers, basically, you like now we have seen the basics of how to declare a pointer, how to change the value, and how to print it, basically. Okay. So now what I can do is, now I want to kind of relate, like perform certain operations related to pointers. Now then again, I think so. I had explained you, like in the functions chapter, like there is a different type of pass by value and pass by reference, right? So we'll do like we'll perform certain operation on that. Okay. So now I'll just say hash include stdio.h. I'll just create a layout. Okay. And now we'll be dealing with functions now, as we know about functions now. So now what we'll do is we'll try to create a function. I think so. We have done a simple program of swapping two numbers, right? So how to swap two numbers? Suppose I have an integer a and b, and suppose say a has suppose value 34, and b has suppose say value -6. Fine, and I want to swap those two numbers. So if you remember, we had taken another, suppose say another variable, and what we did was c is equal to a is equal to b, and b is equal to c, if you remember this one. So before swapping and after swapping, we had done this thing, right? So let's just say slash n before swap a is equal to %d slash t is equal to %d. I'll print the values of a and b. Copy the same line and print it afterwards. Okay, and I'll just say after swap. Okay. Value and reference. Okay, fine. Yeah, so I'll say compile this code, 0 error 0 warnings. I'm running it. Okay, so I'm getting this value, right? The numbers are swapped. Okay, so this was the basic example that we did. Now what if I want to perform the same operation but with the help of function? So now what I can do is, now here, instead of writing this code over here, what I'll do is I'll cut this code. Okay, fine. I'll create a function, suppose say void swap. Okay, fine. And what we'll do is we'll take input as a parameters. Suppose I'll take two values, a and int b. Fine. And in here I'll paste that code. Okay, obviously I'll need to create an integer c as well. Suppose integer c I created here. Okay, so this will be the code. Okay, fine. So I'll just update something in before swap. Suppose in function, I'll suppose write this line. I'll add this line to the bottom printf part also. Okay, and these lines which are there before swap and after swap, I will basically paste it here also. Fine. So before swap, in suppose I'll write main. Fine, and I'll call that swap function, and I'll pass those values a and b, and I'll print that line again, and I'll say after swap in the main function. Okay, I'm printing the values of a and b. Okay, now if I try to compile the code, 0 error 0 warnings, and when I run it, okay, you are getting this output. Now take a look at the output before swapping in main. So what happened was the program execution started, it took the values of a and b. Acha, we don't need this c variable, but then again not an issue. Okay, so it set the values of a and b, and it printed this line first before swap in main. Okay, so whatever the values of a and b are there, it got printed. So a was 34 and b is -6, that got printed. After that, this swap function was called. So the program counter jumped from here, the program like from here to this function, right? So it went inside this function, and then it printed this line before swap in function, right? Okay, so it printed before swap in function, and it got those two values properly. Then it performed certain operations. After performing certain operations, is printed this line before after swap in function, right? And after swap in function, the values were kind of inverted. If you notice, a was firstly a was 34, now it is -6, and b was -6, now it is 34. But the issue is, like when it came back from there, after that when I'm printing here after swap in main, the value has not changed. It is the same. Earlier also in main a was 34, afterwards also a is 34 only. So now there is a problem. So to understand this thing, so let's just say, let me remove this thing. Okay, I'll simply fill it with the white color. Okay, so let's assume basically what has actually happened is, this is your program, I would say. Okay, fine. So suppose say this is your program. Okay, and here is your function part basically. Okay, fine. So let me just say name it first. Okay, so this is your main and this is your swap function. Okay, fine. ठीक है. Anyways, okay, so these are the two functions basically that you have. Okay, now in a function what you did was you created two variables, a and b. Fine. And what you did was you kind of printed that line. Okay, so for printing a and b basically, chalo, I'll assume something like this. You printed the value of a and b over here. I'll populate it in a bit. Okay, fine. Okay, you printed the value of a and b inside this thing. Then you called this function. Okay, then you called the swap function, and after calling that swap function again, what you did was you printed the value of a and b. This was your basic program layout that you created. Okay. Okay, fine. And in swap function also you are doing the same thing basically. You are first printing the values that you got. Okay, you printed the values of a and b. Okay, fine. You performed certain operations, calculations, and after that you again printed the value of a and b. That is what you did in this function basically. Okay, now what is happening, what is the difference basically, I'll explain. Okay, now let's just take this. Okay, if you have 11, maybe I'll make it around about 28, maybe that will be visible. Suppose say now a has value 12, okay, and b has value, suppose say 6. I want to swap these two. Fine, so this is your a variable and this is your b variable. Let me just move that up a bit. Okay, and you did the same thing over here. You kind of printed those values. Okay, let me just put it like this. It has to go like that. Okay, fine. So this is a variable and this is your b variable. So inside your a variable you have got 12 and inside b variable you have got 6. Okay, fine. And the thing is, like when we are calling this swap function over here, okay, when you call that swap function and you are passing the values of a and b, okay, what is actually happening is this function is getting called, right? So from here, okay, so I'll just take a thicker. Okay, okay, so from here basically what it is doing, it is calling this function now. Okay, now the address value of this function, when I am doing this thing, okay, fine, so even if I am creating integer a, integer b, I am creating a copy of these two variables. Okay, So now the address location of these two variables, basically suppose say this is location maybe 100, okay, and the address location of B variable, okay, suppose say it is location 123, okay, fine. So these are the address locations, but when I'm creating variables A and B over here, okay, and when those values are being copied over here, basically, okay, so create this as A variable, this has B variable, okay, they both have certain values. Suppose say this has got 12 and this has got 6 value, right, according to what we said, okay. But the thing is, the address at which these variables are saved, that is different. Means basically these are totally different variables. Suppose say this is saved at 7000 location and this is saved at location 45, okay. So important thing to understand over here is that these are on different locations now, memory locations. So these are a copy of these variables, these are not the original variables, this is a copy, and whatever operation that you are performing, that is being performed on the copy, not the original ones, okay. So in that function, when you see this output, okay, so inside this function the swapping happened successfully because these are other two different variables. So the swapping happened on different variables, but inside the main, which program or which variables were there, those were the same, unchanged, okay. So you can do something, you can return some value, but then again in return value we have one issue that we can only return one value. So what value will you return, A or B? That is also another question, right? So to avoid this problem, or then again to avoid this scenario where kind of when you are kind of doing some processing, so you want to perform the operations on the original variable, not a copy. So in that scenario we'll call, like we'll use pointers now, okay. Now this method which is there, this approach, when we are kind of passing the values to a function and these are direct values, okay, so this is called as pass by value, pass by value, because we are sending the direct value and a copy is being created, okay, fine. So okay, now then again suppose if I create another function, I'll just name it void only. I'll say suppose swap underscore reference maybe, and I'll take some values over here as well, okay, fine. I'll take some integer values only, okay, but what integer values I'll specify in a bit, okay, fine. So let's say comment this out, I don't want to send this, okay, and I'll say comment this entire function as well, okay, fine, okay. So here we want to perform certain operations, but we'll come on to that, okay. So here what we have to do is we have to call that function now, okay. So swap reference, whichever was there, okay, and instead of passing A and B variables directly, so if we pass A and B directly, that will be passed by pass by value. So what I'll do is I'll pass the address location of A and I'll pass the address location of B. Now we have studied pointers, right? So now these address locations, where we'll be saving it, we'll saving it in a pointer. So the variables that will be catching those things, that will be, suppose say I'll say star x and suppose say star y, okay, fine. So I am catching those things. You can take star A and star B also, these are different variables basically now, okay, fine. But then again, just to avoid that complexity or that complication, unwanted complication, I am taking it star x and star y, okay. So suppose I take an integer c, and then again the code which is there, that will be almost similar. I'll simply, if I want to, I can just simply copy it. I'll have to make some minor changes though, okay. So I took an integer c, before swapping in function, a is equal to, I'll just say something, and b is equal to something, and instead of a I'll say star x and I'll say star y, because value at that x location and value at that y location. Similarly I'll copy these two lines, I'll paste it here as well, okay. And instead of doing this thing now, because we don't have a or b variable, we have uh, x and y variables. So what I'll say is star x is equal to c is equal to star x is equal to star y, and star y is equal to c, fine. So what I'm doing is, whatever value is there at this address location, copy that in c variable, okay. whatever value is there in this file location, copy that value and save it in this location. Okay, and whatever the value is in C, save it in this location. Okay, fine. So I'm basically dealing with pointers now. Okay, and the value whichever I've given, I'm giving it with the help of like reference. I am passing this as a reference. So this type of functions or this type of variable parameters where you're passing the address location, that is called as pass by reference. Okay, fine. So let's just say compile this code now, saving it, compiling it, 0 error 0 warnings, running it. Okay, so now if you see, you will get the proper result. Okay, so in function also the swapping has happened properly, and in main also the swapping has happened properly. So the a and b values are being properly swapped. Okay, why? Because the operations that were happening, that happened directly on the function, on these two variables directly, not on a third separate variable. Okay, fine. So this is your basic concept of pointers.